if you were with us a couple of weeks ago, you may remember that at the end of the programme I had to pass on the sad news that Bryan Rodwell had died. And as promised, we're starting off tonight's programme by paying our small tribute to someone who was without doubt one of the finest musicians the organ world has ever known. He was a Yorkshireman born in Keighley, and as far as his professional theatre organ work was concerned in the late 40s and 50s, he was employed by ABC and then later moved on to Granada, officially based at East Ham, playing for Cine Variety, but he did also play and broadcast various instruments on the circuit. His theatre organ training during his teens came from Norman Briggs at the New Victoria, Bradford, and then from someone Bryan admired immensely, Charles Saxby. Bryan used to travel over to the Odeon Leeds for his lessons, and he developed a deep affection for the beautiful Leeds Wurlitzer, and in fact always said it was his all-time favourite theatre organ. He made an LP there in the 60s, and from it comes this superb and typical arrangement of A Foggy Day in London Town. Well, I'm with my predecessor from the Organist Entertains, Robin Richmond. Robin, you must have worked with Bryan Rodwell many times over the years.
Well, we were in the same field. He played in nightclubs. He played Murray's Club, very, very smart club. I don't know if it's still going. He played sophisticated music for shows and dancing. And then he was doing a lot of broadcasting with little combinations and so on and so forth. And he had a most individual style. He was absolutely fantastic in his ideas of arranging music. And I remember when he used to come and record for this program when I was doing it, he'd come to the studio without any music or anything at all. And he'd simply say, "Well, what do you want, Robin?" I'd say, "Well, anything you like." Oh, he said, "No, you tell me." And I'd tell him, and without any bother, he'd sit down and rattle it off.
Just produce the arrangements off the top of his head.
From his ear. And, of course, I used to warn everybody. I said, whatever you do, whenever you meet dear old Bryan, for Lord's sake, don't shake his hand, because he'll break it. He had the strongest pair of hands ever. And he had a lovely sense of humour. And to my way of thinking, people will think that I'm being nice about him just because he's not with us any longer, but it's absolutely true. There was no side with him at all, absolutely not a vestige of side. And it was a most peculiar coincidence that about under a week before I heard that he'd left us, I wrote a little tribute in the Enthusiasts magazine about the most fantastic bit of music I'd ever heard on the cinema organ, and that was Bryan's beautiful playing of Sophisticated Lady. Absolute tenderness. And I called this sonic perfection. And from that, he could play the most aggressive jazz and modern harmonies you've ever heard, right to that. I shall always remember Bryan as a very great professional musician, and a lot of people in our field, as you know, are not necessarily professionals.
Before we get on to Hammond days, Keith, early theatre organ experiences. I mean, you were a great theatre organ lover and played them many times. And hearing Bryan at the theatre organ must have been quite an inspiration, I would have thought, for you.
Absolutely, Nigel. Yes, I remember hearing him for the first time at the Cinema Organ Society meeting at the Granada Greenwich. And I think it was the first time I saw him come up on the lift playing that wonderful signature tune, You Made Me Love You, where it had his head slightly on one side and these marvellous chords coming out of this organ.
Yes, and I don't think anybody really could believe the sort of jazz that Bryan could play on the theatre organ, that you could get a pipe organ to speak as quickly as he did.
No, I think to this day, I don't think anybody in this country has ever even tried to copy him because it was a style of its own.
Yep, and as well as the actual finger work, his pedalling technique was phenomenal,
I
wasn't
think
it?
his pedal technique was absolutely legendary.
Yeah.
I mean, so many organists would come along and just sit there in total awe.
Yeah. Now, in Hammond days, I mean, you did work together a lot. I mean, in what ways did you work?
Yes, really,
in
Bryan
Hammond?
came into the Hammond organ side, first of all travelling Europe for Hammond International. Then he joined me at Hammond UK, and I worked very closely with Bryan because we were presenting organs to dealers and then to the public, and I would write the script and Bryan would then put the music. And it was absolutely marvellous. A classic example, if I can quote, was when we put the piano stop on an organ called the Concorde. It was the first Hammond that used the new technology at that period. And I was expecting to hear some nice little one-finger melody. And out came the lit-off scherzo.
Really? I mean, this is a very difficult question, but I mean, how would you sum up Bryan's musicianship?
Oh, it was quite remarkable. I think the thing was that because of his age, he was slightly younger than many of the well-known theatre organists, and so his influences came from other things, particularly from big bands, from Miller, from Ellington, from Dorsey, and he was able to create this wonderful feel, these dynamics on the organ, and these wonderful harmonies, of course.
Yes, he was a one-off, really, wasn't he?
He was a
Yeah.
total one-off.
Yes. A stunning performance of The Cat, played by Bryan Rodwell, and taken from the Hammond 40th Anniversary LP produced in 1975. Well, as you've heard from Robin Richmond and Keith Beckingham, Bryan really was in a class of his own, with a completely individual approach to playing both theatre organ and electronics. He certainly will be very much missed by all his friends, colleagues and admirers, not just in the organ world, but in the wider musical field as well. Now, in the last 2 or 3 years, Bryan was doing more and more work with Yamaha, and to end this tribute, here's one of the numbers he played during his last recording session for us here at Pebble Mill a few weeks ago, a gorgeous interpretation of Somewhere Over the Rainbow.